Eleanor Hartley stood at the edge of the ballroom with her gloved hands pressed together, watching the man who had not looked at her once in 6 months. Duke Julian Ashford stood near the tall windows, speaking to a group of gentlemen, his face calm and unreadable, as if she did not exist at all. She remembered a time when his eyes used to find hers across a crowded room without effort, when he used to cross entire halls just to greet her first. That time felt like a different life now. It had started on a rainy afternoon nearly a year ago, when her carriage horses had bolted on a narrow road outside London. She still remembered the terror of the wheels sliding, the shouting of the driver, and then the sudden strength of a stranger's arm, pulling her free before the carriage tipped into a ditch. That stranger had been Julian. He had not given his name right away. He had simply held her steady until she stopped shaking, then walked her back to safety without a word about who he was. She learned his title only later, from her aunt, who had gasped at the story, and told her she had been rescued by one of the wealthiest and most guarded men in England. After that day, something had changed between them, or so she had believed. He had called on her aunt's house twice that following month. He had asked her to dance at a small gathering, holding her hand a moment longer than was proper, his gaze steady on hers, in a way that made her heart race long after the music ended. She had allowed herself to hope. She had allowed herself to believe that a man like him, who could have any woman in the country, might actually choose her, a woman with no title, and only a modest inheritance from her late father. Then, without warning, the calls stopped. The invitations he used to send stopped arriving. At the next ball where they crossed paths, he greeted her with a stiff bow and nothing more, his eyes sliding past her as though she were a stranger. She had told herself it meant nothing, that perhaps he was simply busy with his estate, or unwell, or distracted by matters she could not know. But 6 months had passed since then, and the distance had never closed. If anything, it had grown wider with every event they both attended. Tonight was no different. She had worn a pale blue gown that her aunt insisted brought out the color of her eyes, and she had spent nearly an hour arranging her hair, though she was not sure why she still bothered. Perhaps some small, stubborn part of her still hoped he would notice. He had not. He had walked past her not 10 minutes ago, close enough that she caught the scent of cedar on his coat, and he had not so much as turned his head. "You are staring again," her Aunt Margaret whispered beside her, fanning herself slowly. "It does you no favors, my dear. A man who wished to speak with you would have done so by now." "I am not staring," Eleanor said, though she knew it was a lie the moment it left her mouth. She forced her attention toward the dance floor, where couples spun beneath the candlelight, their laughter rising over the music. She told herself she did not care what the Duke thought of her. She told herself this every single night, and every single night it grew a little less true. Margaret patted her arm gently. "There are other gentlemen in this room who would be glad of your attention. You must stop waiting for a man who has made his intentions, or lack of them, very clear." Eleanor said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not sound like an argument she was tired of losing. She glanced once more toward Julian, who was now speaking with his sister, Charlotte, a young woman, with a sharp tongue and a kind heart, who had always been friendly toward Eleanor, even when her brother was not. Charlotte caught Eleanor's eye across the room, and gave her a small, sympathetic smile, the kind of smile that said she understood far more than she was permitted to explain. What Eleanor did not know, and could not have known, was that Julian's silence was not born of indifference at all. It was born of fear, a fear so deep and so carefully hidden that even he struggled to name it most days. He had watched his own father destroy himself slowly, after losing the woman he loved, watched a proud and capable man become a shadow of himself within a few short years. Julian had promised himself long ago that he would never allow himself to love someone so completely that her absence could break him in the same way, and yet, from the very moment he had pulled Eleanor Hartley from that overturned carriage, he had felt something in himself shift that he could not undo, no matter how hard he tried. He had spent the month since then convincing himself that distance was mercy, that if he never allowed the connection between them to grow, he could protect them both from a pain he was certain would come one day. He told himself this every time he saw her across a room and felt his chest tighten. He told himself this every time he caught himself searching for her before he had even realized he was looking. Tonight was no exception. He knew exactly where she stood without needing to turn his head, the pale blue of her gown catching at the edge of his vision like a color he could not stop noticing. "You are doing it again," Charlotte said quietly, following his gaze despite his effort to hide it. "Pretending you do not see her." "I see a great many people tonight, Charlotte. You see one person tonight, and it is not the Marquis or his tedious sons." Charlotte's voice was low but firm. "Eleanor Hartley has done nothing to deserve the way you have treated her, Julian. Everyone can see it, even if you refuse to." Julian's jaw tightened, though he kept his expression composed for the benefit of the room around them. "I have treated her with perfect courtesy." "You have treated her like a stranger, after you saved her life and gave her every reason to believe you cared for her." Charlotte shook her head slowly. "I do not know what frightens you so much about that girl, but whatever it is, you cannot hide from it forever. Not when the whole of London is watching you do it." He did not answer her, because there was no answer he was willing to give, not even to his own sister. Instead, he excused himself and moved toward the refreshment table, putting distance between himself and the conversation, though the distance did nothing to quiet the thoughts already circling in his mind. He allowed himself one glance toward Eleanor as he walked, just one, and found her looking directly back at him for the briefest moment before she turned away, her chin lifting with a quiet dignity that struck him harder than any accusation could have. She had every right to look at him that way. He knew it. He had given her hope and then taken it away without explanation, and no amount of careful reasoning about his own fears made that any kinder a thing to have done. Still, he told himself the same thing he always told himself. It was better this way. Better for her to be free to find happiness elsewhere than to be tied to a man who might one day fail her the way his father had failed everyone who loved him. Across the room, Eleanor forced herself to smile at something her aunt said, though she barely heard the words. She was aware, with the particular sharpness that only comes from caring too much about someone who does not seem to care back, of every movement Julian made. She saw him speak with his sister. She saw the brief, unreadable glance he sent her way, before looking elsewhere. She told herself, again, that it meant nothing. The musicians began a new set, and gentlemen began seeking out their partners for the dance. Eleanor watched the couples take their places, feeling the familiar ache of standing at the edge of something she was not quite part of. She had danced twice already tonight, with acquaintances who meant nothing to her, polite exchanges that passed the time without touching anything beneath the surface. She expected the rest of the evening to continue in the same quiet, disappointing way it always did. She did not expect the tall, broad-shouldered gentleman in a naval officer's coat to approach her with an easy, confident smile, or for her aunt to straighten immediately at his arrival, recognizing him before Eleanor did. "Captain Grey," Margaret said warmly. "I had not heard you were returned to London." "Only these past few days, Lady Margaret." His voice was pleasant, carrying the kind of natural warmth that put people at ease without effort. His eyes moved to Eleanor, and something in his expression sharpened with genuine interest, not the polite blankness she had grown used to from most men in this room. "And I do not believe I have had the pleasure of an introduction to this young lady." "My niece, Miss Eleanor Hartley," Margaret said, practically glowing with the sudden shift in the evening's fortunes. "Eleanor, this is Captain Nathaniel Grey, lately returned from service abroad." "Miss Hartley." He bowed with an easy grace, and when he straightened, his gaze held hers steadily, without the careful distance she had grown so used to from Julian. "I hope you will forgive my boldness in saying that you are, without question, the most interesting person I have seen in this room tonight." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, unused to such direct attention, though she found she did not mind it nearly as much as she expected. "That is a great deal of confidence for a man who has known me for less than a minute, Captain." "I have always found confidence serves better than hesitation, Miss Hartley." His smile widened slightly, warm and unbothered, "though I am happy to spend considerably longer than a minute proving my judgment sound, if you would permit me the pleasure of your company this evening." Margaret nearly nudged her forward with the enthusiasm of a woman who had watched her niece suffer in silence for 6 long months. Eleanor hesitated only a moment, before allowing herself a small, genuine smile, the first one that had come easily to her all evening. "I would like that very much, Captain," she said. She did not look toward the tall windows where Julian stood, though something in her chest told her, without needing to check, that he had already seen every part of this exchange unfold. Captain Nathaniel Grey led Eleanor toward the edge of the dance floor, and she was surprised by how easy it felt to walk beside him, how little effort it took to smile at whatever he said. He asked her questions and seemed genuinely interested in the answers, which was more than she could say for most of the men she had met this season. He asked about her father, and when she explained that he had passed 2 years ago, his expression softened with real sympathy, rather than the polite discomfort she usually received. "He must have been proud of you," Nathaniel said simply, and something in the plainness of the statement settled warmly in her chest. "I hope he would have been," she admitted, "though I am not certain what there is to be proud of. I have no fortune to speak of, no great accomplishments, only a small inheritance, and my aunt's patience." "You underestimate yourself, Miss Hartley. A person's worth is rarely found in fortune." He glanced toward the dance floor as the musicians finished tuning their instruments for the next set. "Would you do me the honor of this dance?" She agreed, before she had fully considered it, and he led her out among the other couples with a confidence that made her feel, for the first time in months, that she was not invisible. As the music began, he held her with an easy familiarity, guiding her through the steps with practiced skill, and she found herself laughing at something he said within the first minute, a real laugh that surprised even her. Across the room, Julian Ashford watched the exchange, with a stillness that betrayed nothing on the surface, though beneath his composed expression, something twisted tightly in his chest. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself that Eleanor deserved to enjoy an evening, deserved to be looked at the way this captain was looking at her, with open admiration rather than careful distance. He told himself all of this, and believed none of it. "You are gripping your glass rather hard," Charlotte observed, appearing at his side with the timing of someone who had been watching him for several minutes already. "I was not aware there was a proper way to hold a glass," Julian said flatly, though he set it down regardless. Charlotte followed his gaze toward the dance floor, where Eleanor was turning gracefully in the captain's arms, her cheeks flushed with genuine pleasure, her eyes bright in a way Julian had not seen directed at anyone in months. Not even at him, not since the early days after the carriage accident, when she used to look at him as though he had personally hung the stars. "That is Captain Nathaniel Gray," Charlotte said, "recently returned from naval service. Quite well regarded, I am told. Brave, charming, and apparently very taken with our Miss Hartley." "She is not our Miss Hartley," Julian said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "No," Charlotte agreed, watching him carefully. "She is not yours at all, is she? Though I wonder if you are only now beginning to understand what that truly means." Julian did not answer. He could not, because every answer he might have given would have required admitting something he had spent 6 months refusing to admit, even to himself. He watched Eleanor laugh again at something the captain said, watched the easy way she leaned toward him as the dance drew them close, and felt something in his chest crack open that he had worked very hard to keep sealed. He remembered, with unwelcome clarity, the day he pulled her from the wreckage of her carriage. He remembered the way she had clung to him without hesitation, trusting him completely, though she did not even know his name. He remembered walking her home afterward, unable to stop glancing at her, already half in love with a woman he had known for less than an hour. He remembered thinking, in that dangerous, unguarded moment, that perhaps this was what his father had felt before everything fell apart. And he remembered deciding, with the cold logic of a man determined never to suffer as his father had suffered, that he would not allow himself to feel that way again. But watching her now, spinning easily in another man's arms, laughing without a single thought spared for him, Julian understood with sudden and unwelcome force that his careful distance had not protected him from anything at all. It had only ensured that when the pain came, as it clearly had, he would have no one to blame but himself. The dance ended, and Nathaniel escorted Eleanor from the floor, with a hand resting lightly at the small of her back, leaning down to say something that made her laugh again. Julian watched them walk toward the refreshment table together, watched Nathaniel fetch her a glass of lemonade with an attentiveness that Julian himself had once offered so easily, and had since abandoned entirely. "Go and speak with her," Charlotte said quietly beside him, "before it is too late to matter." "And say what?" Julian's voice was rougher than he intended. "That I am sorry for treating her as a stranger these past 6 months. That I do not have a reasonable explanation for my behavior that would not sound like the excuse of a coward." "Perhaps the truth would serve you better than an excuse," Charlotte said. "But you must decide quickly, Julian. Men like Captain Gray do not linger long before making their intentions known, and Eleanor Hartley is not the sort of woman who will wait forever for a man who refuses to speak." Julian said nothing, But his eyes did not leave Eleanor for the remainder of the evening, tracking her through every conversation, every smile she offered the captain, every moment that reminded him with painful clarity of everything he had thrown away out of fear. Eleanor, for her part, was trying very hard not to notice that Julian was watching her, though she felt his attention like a warmth against her skin every time she glanced in his direction and found his eyes already on her. It confused her more than she wanted to admit. If he cared so little for her, why did his gaze follow her so closely tonight, when it had avoided her so completely for months? "You seem distracted," Nathaniel observed gently, following the direction of her glance before she could hide it. His expression shifted, understanding dawning. "Ah, the Duke." "It is nothing," Eleanor said quickly, though her cheeks warmed with embarrassment at having been caught so easily. "It does not appear to be nothing." Nathaniel's tone remained kind, without judgment. "Though I will say, Miss Hartley, that a man who allows a woman like you to stand unnoticed for months does not deserve the privilege of your attention now, simply because another man has finally shown him what he was missing." Eleanor looked up at him, surprised by the directness of the observation, and found herself unable to argue with it. "You speak very plainly, Captain. I have found that plain speaking saves a great deal of time and heartache, in matters of the sea and matters of the heart alike." He offered his arm again, nodding toward the garden doors that stood open to the cool evening air. "Would you care to walk? I find ballrooms grow rather warm after a while, and I would enjoy the chance to know you better without an audience." She agreed, grateful for the chance to step away from the weight of Julian's gaze, though some small, stubborn part of her registered a flicker of satisfaction at the thought that he was, even now, still watching her go. The garden was quiet and cool, lit by lanterns strung between the trees, and Nathaniel walked beside her at an easy pace, filling the silence with stories from his time at sea that made her laugh more than once, genuine and unguarded. He told her about storms weathered and ports visited, about the strange comfort of the ocean at night, when the stars seemed close enough to touch. She found herself relaxing in his company, in a way she had not relaxed around anyone in a very long time. "You are easy to talk to, Miss Hartley," he said eventually, as they paused near a small fountain at the center of the garden. "I confess, I did not expect to enjoy this evening nearly as much as I have." "Nor did I," Eleanor admitted honestly. "I had resigned myself to another quiet night at the edge of the room. Then I am glad I arrived when I did." His gaze held hers, warm and steady, and for a moment, she allowed herself to simply enjoy being looked at by someone who did not seem burdened by whatever secret weight Julian carried whenever he glanced her way. "I would like to call on you properly, if your aunt would permit it. I find myself rather eager to know more of you, Miss Hartley, and I do not believe in wasting time once I have found something worth pursuing." Eleanor's heart beat a little faster at the sincerity in his voice, and though some quiet, stubborn corner of her mind still ached with unanswered questions about Julian, she found herself nodding. "I believe my aunt would be very pleased to receive you, Captain." He smiled, pleased, and offered his arm once more to walk her back toward the lights and music of the ballroom. Neither of them noticed the figure standing just beyond the garden doors, half hidden in shadow, who had watched the entire exchange with an expression of quiet, aching regret. Julian had followed them at a distance he told himself was accidental, though he knew, even as he stood there, that it was nothing of the sort. He had heard enough of their conversation to understand that Captain Gray intended to court Eleanor properly, and that she intended to allow it. The realization settled in his chest like a stone, heavy and cold, and for the first time in 6 months, he allowed himself to fully acknowledge what he had been refusing to admit since the day he pulled her from that overturned carriage. He loved her. He had loved her for a long time, and his fear of losing her the way his father had lost everything had cost him the very thing he was trying to protect. Watching her walk back into the ballroom on another man's arm, laughing softly at something he said, Julian understood that his silence had not kept him safe at all. It had simply guaranteed the loss he feared, delivered by his own hand. He remained in the shadows a moment longer, gathering himself, before returning to the ballroom with his expression carefully composed once more. But something inside him had shifted tonight, a quiet, resolute decision forming beneath the surface of his careful control. He would not continue standing at the edges of rooms, watching Eleanor Hartley slip further away from him with every passing week. Whatever it cost him, whatever fears he had to face, he intended to fight for her before it was too late. He simply did not yet know if he had already waited too long. Word of the Duke's strange reaction at the ball traveled through London faster than Eleanor could have imagined. Within 2 days, her aunt had heard the story from no fewer than 3 separate acquaintances, each version slightly more dramatic than the last. Some said Julian had nearly dropped his glass when Captain Gray asked Eleanor to dance. Others claimed he had left the ball early, unable to bear the sight of her happiness with another man. Eleanor did not know which parts were true, and which had grown in the retelling, but she could not deny the strange thrill that ran through her at the thought that he had reacted at all. "You see," Margaret said one morning over tea, her voice practically bursting with satisfaction, "I told you a little attention from another gentleman would do you good. The whole of London is speaking of how the Duke could not take his eyes off you the entire evening, and now Captain Gray has sent flowers 3 days running. You are quite the topic of conversation, my dear." Eleanor turned her teacup slowly in its saucer, unable to fully enjoy the news the way her aunt clearly wanted her to. Part of her felt a small, guilty satisfaction at the thought of Julian finally reacting to her presence after months of cold indifference. But a larger part of her felt confused, even hurt, that it had taken another man's interest to provoke any response from him at all. If he cared, truly cared, why had he waited until she was no longer looking for his attention to finally show it? "It does not signify," she said quietly. "Whatever he felt that evening, he has made no effort to speak with me since. 6 months of silence is not undone by a single strange expression at a ball." "Perhaps not," Margaret allowed, though her eyes remained sharp with interest. "But Captain Gray, on the other hand, has made his intentions rather clear. He called yesterday while you were out walking, and left his card along with an invitation to accompany us to the theater this Thursday. I do think, Eleanor, that you might allow yourself to consider him seriously. He is a good man, from a respectable family, and he seems genuinely taken with you." Eleanor considered this for a long moment. Nathaniel Gray was, by any reasonable measure, an excellent match. He was kind, attentive, successful in his career, and he had shown her more warmth in a handful of days than Julian had shown her in 6 months. There was no logical reason to hesitate, and yet some stubborn, aching part of her heart still turned toward the Duke whenever she allowed her thoughts to wander unguarded. She was still turning these thoughts over when a letter arrived that afternoon, delivered by a footman in Ashford livery. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal, recognizing the careful, elegant handwriting immediately as Julian's own. The letter was brief, formal in its wording, and yet the very fact that he had written it all after months of silence sent her heart racing. "Miss Hartley," it began, "I hope this letter finds you well. I would be grateful for the opportunity to call upon you at your earliest convenience, should you be willing to receive me. There are matters I have neglected to address for far too long, and I find I can no longer allow that neglect to continue. Yours, Julian Ashford." She read the letter 3 times before setting it down, her thoughts a tangled mess of hope and caution. 6 months of silence, and now this, arriving within days of Captain Gray's attentions becoming public knowledge. She wanted to believe that Julian's feelings were genuine, that his sudden interest sprang from something real, rather than simple jealousy at seeing another man succeed where he had failed to try. But she could not entirely silence the small voice, reminding her how easily he had turned away from her before, how quickly his warmth had cooled the very first time she allowed herself to hope. "Well," Margaret said, reading the letter over Eleanor's shoulder without any pretense of discretion, "it seems the Duke has finally found his courage. What will you do?" "I do not know," Eleanor admitted honestly. "Part of me wishes to refuse him entirely, to let him understand what it feels like to be dismissed without explanation. But another part of me—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought aloud. "Another part of you still cares for him," Margaret finished gently. "There is no shame in that, my dear. But you must protect your own heart in whatever you decide. A man does not simply forget 6 months of coldness because he wrote a single letter." Eleanor spent the following days in a state of quiet turmoil, torn between the steady, easy comfort of Captain Gray's company and the unresolved ache that Julian's letter had reopened. Nathaniel called twice more that week, each visit warm and pleasant, filled with easy conversation and genuine laughter. He brought her a small book of poetry he thought she might enjoy, and sat with her in the garden discussing everything from her favorite novels to his hopes for his next assignment at sea. He was, in every way, an easy man to grow fond of. and yet Julian's letter sat on her writing desk, unanswered, drawing her attention every time she passed it. She had not yet decided whether to permit him to call, though the temptation grew stronger with each passing day. Finally, on the fourth day, she sat down and wrote a brief reply, agreeing to receive him the following afternoon, though she gave herself firm instructions not to allow his presence to undo the careful guard she had built around her heart. Julian arrived precisely on time, dressed with less formality than she usually saw him in public, as though he had made some deliberate effort to appear less like a duke and more like a man who had come to speak plainly. Margaret greeted him with polite reserve before excusing herself to the next room, leaving the door open only slightly, enough to satisfy propriety, while granting them a measure of privacy. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," Julian said, his voice quieter than she remembered, stripped of the careful formality he usually wore like armor. "I know I have given you little reason to grant me that courtesy." "You have given me none at all," Eleanor said, keeping her tone level, though her heart pounded uncomfortably in her chest. 6 months of silence is a great deal to overcome with a single letter, Your Grace. He winced slightly at the formal address, though he did not correct her. "You are right to be angry with me. I have thought of little else these past few days but how to explain myself, and I confess I still do not have words adequate to the task. But I owe you an attempt, at the very least." Eleanor said nothing, waiting, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Julian took a slow breath, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a rawness she had never heard from him before. "My father loved my mother very deeply. I do not know if you are aware of this, but after she passed, he was never the same man again. He withdrew from everyone who cared for him, from his own children, from every responsibility he once carried with pride. He simply faded, year after year, until there was almost nothing left of the man I remembered from my childhood. I watched it happen slowly, over the course of many years, and I promised myself I would never allow love to have that kind of power over me." He paused, and Eleanor found her anger softening slightly despite herself, though she said nothing yet, sensing there was more he needed to say. "The day I pulled you from that carriage," he continued, "I felt something I had spent years training myself never to feel. It frightened me more than I can properly explain. I told myself that if I kept my distance, if I never allowed what was growing between us to take root, I could protect us both from the kind of pain I watched destroy my father. I was wrong, Eleanor. I understand that now, though I understand it far too late, it seems." His eyes met hers, steady despite the vulnerability in them. "Watching you with Captain Gray these past weeks has shown me, in the clearest possible terms, exactly what my fear has cost me. I do not expect you to forgive 6 months of neglect simply because I have finally found the courage to admit my mistake. But I could not continue watching you slip away without at least telling you the truth." Eleanor sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing everything he had said, her heart caught between the old ache of months of dismissal and the unexpected tenderness of finally understanding why. "You could have told me any of this months ago," she said quietly. "You could have spared us both a great deal of pain." "I know," he said simply, without excuse or defense. "I was a coward, and you deserved better than my cowardice." "Yes," she agreed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I did." Julian nodded, accepting the rebuke without protest, though something in his expression suggested he had expected far worse. "I do not ask you to forget Captain Gray's attentions, or to abandon whatever understanding you may have reached with him. I only ask that you know the truth of my own feelings, whatever you choose to do with that knowledge. I have loved you, Eleanor, since the moment you looked at me in that overturned carriage, and trusted me without question, though you did not even know my name. I have been a fool to waste the months since then in silence." Eleanor's breath caught at the plain, unguarded honesty of the declaration, so different from the careful distance he had maintained for so long. Part of her wanted to forgive him instantly, to let 6 months of hurt dissolve in the face of his confession. But a larger, more cautious part of her held back, unwilling to abandon her own dignity so easily after everything she had endured. "I appreciate your honesty, Julian," she said finally, using his given name for the first time in months, though her tone remained careful. "But honesty alone cannot undo the damage of half a year's silence. I have allowed myself to consider Captain Gray's attentions seriously during that time, and I cannot simply set that consideration aside because you have finally decided to speak." "I understand," Julian said, though the words seemed to cost him something significant. "I do not ask you to choose between us today. I ask only for the chance to prove, over time, that my feelings are genuine, and that I intend to act on them rather than hide from them as I have done before." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any trace of the careful, distant man who had ignored her for months, and finding instead someone who looked, for perhaps the first time since she had known him, entirely without pretense. "I cannot promise you anything, Julian," she said slowly, "but I will not refuse to see you again, if that is what you are asking." Relief flickered across his features, quickly controlled but unmistakable. "That is more than I deserve, and more than I expected. Thank you, Eleanor." He took his leave shortly after, and Eleanor sat alone in the quiet parlor for a long while after he had gone, her thoughts a tangled storm of conflicting emotions. She had spent 6 months convincing herself that Julian's coldness meant indifference, and now she found herself faced with the far more complicated truth that he had cared deeply the entire time, hidden beneath a fear he had only just found the courage to voice. It did not erase the hurt of those months, but it changed the shape of it, softened its edges in a way she had not expected. That evening, as she prepared for bed, another note arrived, this one from Captain Gray, asking if she might accompany him to a garden party the following weekend. She read it twice, her thoughts pulled once more between two very different men, who had each, in their own way, shown her that she was worth pursuing. She did not yet know which path her heart would ultimately choose, but she understood, with growing clarity, that the choice would soon have to be made, and that both men deserved an answer she could stand behind with her whole heart. The weeks that followed brought a strange new rhythm into Eleanor's life, one shaped by the careful attentions of two very different men, each determined to earn a place in her future. Captain Nathaniel Gray called on her often, his visits filled with easy laughter, long walks through the park, and a warmth that never seemed to waver or falter. He spoke openly of his hopes, his plans for the years ahead, and made no secret of his growing affection for her. Julian, on the other hand, approached her with a quieter, more careful sort of devotion, as though he was still learning how to show feelings he had spent years suppressing. Where Nathaniel offered certainty, Julian offered something more complicated, a man clearly working against the instincts that had kept him distant for so long, determined now to prove that his change of heart was genuine, rather than a passing reaction to jealousy. Eleanor found herself caught between the two, unable to fully commit her heart to either, while so much remained unresolved. It was at a garden party hosted by one of her aunt's oldest friends that matters began to come to a head. Nathaniel had arrived early, securing a place beside Eleanor at the refreshment tables, attentive as always, filling their conversation with stories of his recent promotion and hints about a posting that might keep him in London for the foreseeable future, rather than sending him back out to sea. Eleanor listened with genuine interest, grateful for his steady presence, though she could not help but notice Julian's arrival across the lawn, his eyes finding hers almost immediately, despite the distance between them. "He watches you rather intently, does he not?" Nathaniel observed, following her gaze without any trace of jealousy in his tone, only quiet, thoughtful understanding. "I confess I did not expect the Duke to pursue you so openly after all those months of silence. It is a rather sudden change of heart." "He says he has always cared," Eleanor said carefully, unsure how much to share, that his silence came from fear rather than indifference. Fear of what, precisely? Of loving someone too deeply, and losing them the way his father lost his mother. She hesitated, then added, "I believe him, Nathaniel, though I am not certain that belief changes anything about the months he allowed to pass in silence." Nathaniel considered this for a long moment, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "I will not pretend I am not concerned by his sudden interest, Eleanor. I have grown genuinely fond of you these past weeks, fonder than I expected when we first met at that ball. I would be lying if I said the thought of losing your attention to another man did not trouble me." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But I also believe you deserve to make this choice honestly, without me pressuring you toward a decision, before you are ready to make it. I only ask that you consider carefully what kind of man deserves your future. One who found the courage to fight for you only after seeing another man succeed where he had failed, or one who has shown you steady, consistent care from the very beginning." His words settled uncomfortably in Eleanor's chest, not because they were unkind, but because they carried a truth she had been avoiding examining too closely. She had no answer for him in that moment, and he did not press for one, simply offering her his arm and guiding the conversation toward lighter matters as the party continued around them. Julian approached later that afternoon, once Nathaniel had been drawn into conversation with several other officers near the far end of the garden. He found Eleanor sitting alone beneath a large oak tree, and he settled beside her with the careful, deliberate manner of a man who had rehearsed what he wished to say. "You look troubled," he observed gently. "I have a great deal to consider," she admitted, deciding there was little point in pretending otherwise with him now, given everything he had already confessed to her. "Captain Gray has been very direct about his feelings for me. He speaks of a future together quite openly." Something flickered across Julian's face, quickly controlled, though not quickly enough to hide entirely. "And what do you feel when he speaks of such things?" "I feel valued," Eleanor said honestly. "I feel as though he sees me clearly and wants me without hesitation or complication." Julian absorbed this quietly, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "I cannot offer you the same simplicity, Eleanor. I wish I could. I have spent years building walls around my own heart, and though I am trying, truly trying, to tear them down for you, I understand that the effort itself may not be enough to undo the damage of my earlier silence." "Why are you telling me this now?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious. "You could simply continue courting me as you have these past weeks, without highlighting your own uncertainty." "Because you deserve honesty," Julian said simply. "You have had enough of my silence to last a lifetime. I would rather you understand exactly what you are choosing, if you do choose me, than build a future together on false certainty." He met her eyes directly. "I love you, Eleanor. That much I know without doubt. But I am still learning how to love without fear standing between us, and I think it only fair that you know the whole of that struggle before you decide whether it is worth facing alongside me." Eleanor found herself moved by the honesty, even as it complicated her decision further rather than simplifying it. Nathaniel offered certainty and ease. Julian offered depth and struggle, a love that had nearly been lost to fear but was fighting, visibly and painfully, to reclaim itself. She did not know, sitting beneath that oak tree with the sounds of the garden party drifting around her, which kind of love would serve her better in the years to come. That evening, as she prepared for bed, Eleanor received an unexpected visit from Charlotte, Julian's sister, who arrived at her aunt's home with an urgency that suggested the matter could not wait for a more conventional hour. "I hope you will forgive the intrusion," Charlotte said, settling into the parlor with visible determination. "But I felt I owed you the truth of my brother's situation, since I do not believe he would ever tell you the whole of it himself, out of some misplaced sense of pride." "What truth is that?" Eleanor asked, curious, despite her exhaustion from the day's events. "My brother has not simply been distant these past months, out of vague fear," Charlotte said. "He has spent that time actively convincing himself that pursuing you would be selfish, that a man burdened by the responsibilities of a dukedom and by memories of what happened to our father has no right to ask a woman to share that burden. He has been protecting you from himself, Eleanor, as much as protecting himself from loss. It is a foolish, stubborn sort of nobility, but it is nobility nonetheless, however badly he has expressed it." Eleanor absorbed this new information slowly, feeling the picture of Julian's behavior shift once again, gaining new dimensions she had not previously considered. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I have watched my brother suffer needlessly for months, convinced he was doing right by pushing you away, only to watch him suffer worse these past weeks. Terrified he has lost you permanently to Captain Gray," Charlotte said plainly. "I do not say this to pressure you toward any particular decision, Eleanor. You must choose whatever makes you happiest, and both men are, in their own ways, worthy of consideration. But I could not stand by and let you make that choice without understanding the full truth of what my brother has been carrying all this time." Eleanor thanked her sincerely, and after Charlotte departed, she sat alone in the quiet parlor for a long while, turning the new information over in her mind. Julian's silence, it seemed, had never been about indifference at all, not even in its earliest, most painful months. It had been about a tangled, misguided attempt to protect her from a burden he believed unworthy of her happiness, layered over a fear of loss inherited from his father's own tragedy. Understanding the reasons did not entirely undo the pain of those months, but it softened something in her chest, that had remained hard and guarded since the very first ball where he had turned away from her without explanation. She realized, sitting there in the quiet, that her decision would not be made based on which man offered the easier path, but on which man she could not imagine building a life without. And though she was not yet ready to admit it fully, even to herself, some deep and honest part of her already knew the answer. The following morning, a letter arrived from Captain Gray, its tone more formal than his previous correspondence, requesting a private audience with her aunt to discuss the possibility of a formal courtship, one that would, within a reasonable time, lead toward an engagement. Eleanor read the letter with a strange, hollow feeling in her chest, understanding that the moment of choice she had been quietly avoiding could no longer be postponed. She would have to decide, and soon, which future she wanted for herself, and which man she was willing to trust with the whole of her heart. Eleanor did not sleep well the night after Captain Gray's letter arrived. She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling of her small bedroom, turning the decision over and over in her mind without arriving at any clarity. By morning, she had resolved at least one thing, that she would not give her aunt permission to receive Nathaniel for such a serious discussion until she had spoken with him honestly about the uncertainty still lingering in her heart. She sent word asking him to call that afternoon, and he arrived promptly, his expression carrying a hopeful eagerness that made what she had to say all the more difficult. They walked together in the garden behind her aunt's house, the autumn air cool and crisp around them, and Eleanor found herself struggling to find the right words. "You wished to speak with me before I called on your aunt," Nathaniel said gently, sensing her hesitation. "I take it that means you have concerns about my letter." "I do," Eleanor admitted. "Nathaniel, you have been nothing but kind to me these past weeks. You have shown me a warmth and consistency I did not expect to find, and I am deeply grateful for it. But I do not believe it would be fair to you, or to myself, to proceed toward a formal courtship while my heart remains uncertain." Something in his expression tightened, though he kept his composure admirably. "This concerns the Duke, I assume." "Yes," she said honestly, seeing no point in denying it. "I have come to understand things about his silence these past months that I did not know before. It does not erase the pain of that time, but it changes how I understand it. And I find that I cannot, in good conscience, agree to a future with you, while that understanding sits unresolved in my heart." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, though when he finally spoke, his voice remained steady and controlled. "I appreciate your honesty, Eleanor, even if it is not the answer I hoped for. I will say this, however. A man who allows fear to govern his actions for 6 months is not necessarily a man who has conquered that fear simply because he has spoken a few honest words to you. I would ask you to consider carefully whether his change of heart is truly complete, or whether it is simply a temporary courage, born of the threat of losing you to someone else." The words struck her harder than she expected, echoing doubts she had not fully allowed herself to voice, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. "That is a fair concern," she admitted quietly. "I do not have an answer for it yet." "Then perhaps you should find one, before you close the door on what I have offered you," Nathaniel said, though his tone remained gentle rather than bitter. "I will not pretend I am not disappointed, Eleanor. I have grown to care for you a great deal these past weeks, but I would rather see you happy with an honest choice than trapped in a courtship built on obligation rather than certainty. Take whatever time you need. I will not press you further, though I cannot promise to wait indefinitely either." He took his leave shortly after, and Eleanor watched him go with a heavy heart, grateful for his understanding, even as she recognized the quiet finality in his final words. She did not have much time left to make her decision, and both men, in their own ways, deserved an answer she could give with her whole heart rather than half of it. That evening, unable to bear the weight of her own uncertainty any longer, Eleanor made a decision that surprised even herself. She sent a note to Ashford House, requesting that Julian meet her the following morning, in the small private garden behind the Ashford townhouse, a place Charlotte had once described to her as Julian's favorite spot on the entire estate, somewhere he went when he needed to think clearly away from the demands of his title. Julian arrived before she did the next morning, standing near a stone bench beneath a canopy of autumn leaves, his expression a mixture of hope and apprehension when he saw her approaching. "Eleanor, I confess I did not expect to hear from you so soon after our conversation at the garden party. I needed to speak with you plainly," she said, settling onto the bench, though she did not immediately sit close beside him. Captain Gray has asked to formally court me, with the intention of marriage. I have asked him to wait, because I find I cannot give him an honest answer, while my own feelings remain so unresolved. Julian's expression flickered with something that looked almost like relief, quickly followed by careful restraint, as though he did not wish to celebrate too soon. What is it you need from me, to help resolve that uncertainty? The truth, Eleanor said simply. The whole truth, Julian, not the careful, measured version you gave me before. Charlotte came to see me. She told me things about your reasoning, that you did not share yourself, about believing you were protecting me from the burdens of your title, from the fear you inherited from watching your father suffer. I want to hear that from you directly, not secondhand from your sister. Julian was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the careful control she had grown used to from him. You are right to ask for that. I have given you half-truths dressed as full honesty, and you deserve better. He took a slow breath, gathering himself. When my father lost my mother, he did not simply grieve. He collapsed entirely, and in doing so, he failed every single person who depended on him, myself included. I was young, but I remember it clearly, the way our household fell apart around us while he sat locked away in his study, unable to function. I swore to myself that I would never allow love to hold that kind of power over me, because I saw firsthand what it did to a man who let it. He paused, his eyes distant with memory, before continuing. When I met you, when I felt myself falling for you so quickly after that accident, I did not simply fear losing you one day. I feared becoming my father, feared that if I allowed myself to love you completely, I would lose the ability to fulfill my duties, to be the kind of duke my people and my family deserved. I convinced myself that pushing you away was an act of protection, both for you and for everyone who depended on me. I told myself you deserved a man who could love you without the risk of collapsing under that love's weight, and that I was not that man. And now? Eleanor asked quietly. What has changed? Watching you with Captain Gray showed me something I had refused to see before, Julian said. I realized that avoiding love entirely had not protected me from pain at all. It had simply guaranteed a different kind of pain, one born of my own cowardice rather than loss. I understood, watching you laugh with him, dance with him, consider a future with him, that I had already lost the very thing I was so desperately trying to protect myself from losing. The fear had cost me exactly what it promised to prevent. He met her eyes directly, his expression open and unguarded in a way she had never seen from him before. I do not know if I can promise you that I will never struggle with that fear again, Eleanor. I do not know if I can promise you perfect strength in the face of it, but I can promise you that I will not run from it again, not if it means losing you. I would rather face that fear beside you than protect myself from it alone. Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes, moved by the raw honesty of his words, so different from the careful distance he had maintained for so long. You hurt me badly, Julian, she said, her voice trembling slightly. 6 months of silence is not a small thing to overcome, however good your reasons. I know, he said simply, not flinching from the accusation. I do not ask you to forget that pain, or to pretend it did not happen. I only ask for the chance to prove, over time, that I have truly changed, that the man standing before you now is not the same man who turned away from you at that ball 6 months ago. She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face, searching for any trace of the doubt that had colored her earlier conversation with Nathaniel. She found none. What she found instead was a man who had faced his deepest fear and chosen, deliberately, and with full understanding of the risk, to fight for her anyway. I have already promised Captain Gray an answer, she said finally. I cannot give him one, while my heart remains here, with you, however complicated that truth might be. Something in Julian's expression broke open with hope, carefully restrained though it was. Does that mean? It means I need time, Eleanor said gently, though a small, genuine smile touched her lips, despite the seriousness of the conversation. But it also means that when I give Captain Gray his answer, I already know, in my heart, what that answer will be. Julian reached for her hand, and she allowed him to take it, his fingers closing around hers with a gentleness that carried the weight of everything unspoken between them. Then I will wait for however long you need, he said quietly. I have already wasted 6 months. I will not compound that mistake by rushing you now." They sat together in the quiet garden for a long while after that, the autumn leaves drifting down around them, neither of them speaking, simply allowing the fragile new understanding between them to settle. Eleanor knew there was still one difficult conversation left before her. One final piece of honesty she owed to a man who had shown her nothing but kindness these past weeks. But for the first time in 6 months, she felt something in her chest settle into a quiet, hopeful certainty about where her heart truly belonged. Eleanor knew she owed Captain Gray a proper conversation, not a note delivered by a footman, and certainly not silence stretched out until he understood her answer without ever hearing it from her own lips. She sent word asking him to call the following afternoon, and he arrived with the same easy composure he always carried, though there was a guarded quality to his expression that told her he already suspected what she meant to say. They walked together in the garden once more, the same path they had walked so many times over the past weeks, filled now with a different sort of silence than before. "You have made your decision," Nathaniel said finally, not quite a question. "I have," Eleanor confirmed, choosing her words carefully, wanting to honor the genuine kindness he had shown her, even as she prepared to disappoint him. "Nathaniel, you have been one of the finest men I have ever had the privilege of knowing. You showed me warmth and attention when I badly needed it, and you never once made me feel unworthy of your regard. I will always be grateful for that. But your heart belongs to the Duke," he finished for her, his voice steady, despite the flicker of hurt that crossed his features. "Yes," she admitted softly. "I am sorry, Nathaniel. You deserve a woman who can give you the whole of her heart without hesitation, and I cannot be that woman, however much I might wish otherwise." He was quiet for a long moment, staring out across the garden, before finally nodding slowly. "I suspected as much. From the moment I saw the way he watched you at that first ball, I told myself I had a fair chance regardless, and perhaps I did, for a time. But I cannot fault a woman for choosing where her heart truly lies, even when that choice is not myself." He turned to face her fully, his expression softening into something genuine and unguarded. "I hope he understands what he nearly lost, Eleanor, and I hope he spends the rest of his days making certain he never repeats the mistake of those 6 silent months. You deserve nothing less than a man who values you openly, every single day." "Thank you, Nathaniel," Eleanor said, her eyes bright with unshed tears at his grace in the face of disappointment. "For everything. For showing me that I was worthy of pursuit, even when I had convinced myself otherwise." He offered her a small, genuine smile, though sadness lingered behind it. "Take care of yourself, Miss Hartley. I do not doubt our paths will cross again in society, and I hope, when they do, we might remain friends, if nothing more." "I would like that very much," she said sincerely, and after a final, warm farewell, he took his leave, walking away from her aunt's house with the quiet dignity of a man who had fought honorably for something he ultimately did not win, but who bore no bitterness for the loss. Word of Eleanor's decision spread through London society with the same speed as every other piece of gossip involving the Duke of Ashford, and within days, the story of his 6 months of silence, followed by his dramatic pursuit once a rival appeared, had become one of the most discussed romances of the season. Some praised the tale as deeply romantic, a man overcoming his own fears to claim the woman he loved. Others whispered that Eleanor was foolish to forgive such prolonged neglect so easily. Eleanor found she did not particularly care which version of the story others chose to believe. She knew the truth of it, the long and complicated path that had brought her and Julian to this point, and that truth belonged to no one but the two of them. Julian, for his part, spent the following weeks proving through consistent action exactly what he had promised in that quiet garden conversation. He called on her regularly, without fail, never allowing more than a day or two to pass without some gesture of his continued devotion. He introduced her formally to members of his family beyond Charlotte, spoke openly of his intentions to friends and acquaintances alike, and made certain that no one in London could mistake his feelings for indifference ever again. Where he had once avoided her gaze across crowded rooms, he now sought her out immediately upon entering any gathering, crossing entire halls just to stand beside her, exactly as he had done in the earliest days after the carriage accident, before fear had taken hold of him. The final test of his transformation came nearly 2 months later, at a grand ball hosted by the same family whose gathering had first brought Eleanor and Julian together after her accident. and whose ballroom had witnessed 6 long months of his careful, painful distance. Eleanor arrived that evening in a gown of deep emerald green, her nerves fluttering slightly as she stepped into the same hall where she had once stood at the edges, invisible to the man she loved. This time, Julian was waiting for her the moment she arrived, crossing the room without hesitation the instant she entered, drawing curious glances and whispered commentary from every corner of the ballroom. He offered his arm with a warm, unguarded smile, entirely unbothered by the attention their reunion drew. "You look radiant tonight," he said softly, leading her toward the edge of the dance floor as the musicians began tuning their instruments for the evening's first set. "You are staring," Eleanor teased gently, echoing words her aunt had once used to describe Julian's own careful avoidance of her gaze. "I intend to stare at you for the rest of my life, if you will allow it," Julian said, his voice carrying a quiet seriousness beneath the lightness of the words. He paused, and something in his expression shifted, gathering courage for what came next. "In fact, Eleanor, I find I am rather tired of merely staring. I would like, very much, to ask you something, though I confess I have been rehearsing the words for days, without finding any that feel adequate to what I actually wish to say." Eleanor's breath caught, understanding immediately what he intended, her heart racing as the room around them seemed to fade into distant background noise. Julian reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, and though propriety might have called for a private setting, he made no move to seek one out, choosing instead the very ballroom where his silence had once caused her so much pain, transforming it now into the setting for an entirely different memory. "Eleanor Hartley," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident beneath it, loud enough for those nearby to hear, though his eyes never left hers. "I spent 6 months allowing fear to convince me that pushing you away was an act of protection, for you and for myself both. I was wrong, in every possible way a man can be wrong. You are not something to be protected from. You are everything I did not know I was searching for until the moment you looked at me in that overturned carriage and trusted me without question. I do not wish to spend another single day pretending I do not love you, in front of this room or any other. Will you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife?" The ballroom had grown quiet around them, conversations pausing, as the story that had captivated London society for weeks reached its unmistakable conclusion in front of everyone's eyes. Eleanor felt tears gathering, though they were tears of pure happiness rather than the pain that had characterized so much of the past year. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room, a smile breaking across her face that erased every trace of the uncertainty and hurt of the previous months. "Yes, Julian, I will marry you." The room erupted into applause and delighted murmurs as Julian slipped the ring onto her finger, his own expression alight with a joy that seemed to banish every last trace of the guarded, distant man he had once been. He pulled her into an embrace, careless of the many eyes watching them, and Eleanor laughed through her happy tears, finally, completely certain of exactly where she belonged. Across the room, Charlotte watched with tears of her own, gripping the arm of a nearby friend with barely contained delight, while even Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, thoroughly vindicated in every prediction she had ever made about the eventual outcome of Eleanor's long and complicated courtship. As the musicians resumed playing, Julian led Eleanor onto the dance floor for the very first dance of the evening, holding her close as they moved together beneath the same chandeliers that had once witnessed his careful avoidance of her, now witnessing instead the beginning of a future neither of them intended to waste another single moment doubting. The months of silence had cost them both dearly, but standing together now, chosen openly and completely in front of everyone who had once watched him turn away, Eleanor understood that some love stories required a difficult beginning to arrive at the ending they were always meant to have. The wedding took place on a bright morning in early spring, in the small stone chapel near the Ashford estate, surrounded by close family and the handful of friends who had watched their story unfold over the past difficult year. Eleanor wore a simple gown of ivory silk, far less extravagant than many expected of a duke's bride, though she insisted it suited her better than anything more elaborate, and Julian had agreed without hesitation, telling her she would look beautiful regardless of what she chose to wear. Charlotte stood beside her throughout the morning, helping with the final touches to her hair and gown, her excitement barely contained. "I confess," she said, adjusting a small flower behind Eleanor's ear. There were months when I feared my brother would never find the courage to claim the happiness sitting right in front of him. I am endlessly relieved to have been wrong about how it would end. He found his courage in time, Eleanor said softly, smiling at her reflection in the small mirror. That is what matters most now. The ceremony itself was brief but deeply felt, and when Julian slipped the wedding ring onto her finger, his hands trembled slightly, betraying the depth of emotion beneath his composed exterior. Eleanor felt her own heart swell as she looked up at him, remembering the cold, distant man who had once avoided her gaze across crowded ballrooms, and marveling at how completely he had transformed into someone capable of such open, unguarded devotion. Their wedding breakfast that followed was a modest affair by the standards of the aristocracy, held in the gardens of the Ashford estate rather than some grand hall, exactly as Eleanor had requested. She wanted their beginning as husband and wife to feel personal and warm, not another spectacle for London society to dissect and discuss. Julian had agreed readily, understanding, perhaps better than anyone, how much she valued sincerity over spectacle, after everything they had endured together. As the afternoon wore on, guests mingling beneath the blossoming trees, Julian drew Eleanor aside to a quiet corner of the garden, away from the celebration for a few stolen moments alone. "Do you remember?" he asked, taking her hands in his. "The first ball after your accident, when I danced with you, and could not stop looking at you the entire evening?" "I remember," Eleanor said, smiling at the memory, despite the pain that had followed it. "I remember thinking I had never felt so certain of anything as I did that night, believing you felt the same way I did." "I did feel the same way," Julian said quietly. "I simply lacked the courage to admit it, even to myself, until fear very nearly cost me everything." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles. "I intend to spend the rest of my life making up for those 6 months of silence, Eleanor. Every single day, for as long as we both shall live." "You do not owe me a debt to repay, Julian," she said gently, though she was moved deeply by the sincerity of his promise. "You have already shown me, these past months, exactly who you truly are. That is more than enough." "Perhaps," he allowed, his eyes warm with affection. "But I intend to keep showing you anyway, every day, simply because I want to, not because I feel obligated to make amends." They returned to the celebration soon after, greeted warmly by family and friends, who had gathered to witness the joyful conclusion of a courtship that had captured the attention of the entire season. As the sun began to set over the Ashford estate, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and pink, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the long and difficult path that had brought her to this moment, from the terror of the overturned carriage, through months of painful silence and confusion, to the eventual, hard-won happiness she now held in her hands. She thought too of Captain Grey, and hoped sincerely that he had found, or would soon find, a happiness of his own, equal to what she now shared with Julian. He had been kind to her when she needed kindness most, and she carried genuine gratitude for the role he had played in helping her understand her own heart, even if their paths had ultimately led in different directions. Later that evening, as the guests began to depart and the estate grew quiet around them, Julian and Eleanor walked together through the same garden where he had first confessed the truth of his fears, months earlier, beneath the very trees that had witnessed the beginning of their reconciliation. The autumn leaves that had once covered the ground had long since given way to fresh spring blossoms, a fitting symbol, Eleanor thought, of how thoroughly their story had transformed since those difficult early months. "I love you, Eleanor Ashford," Julian said softly, using her new name for the first time, testing the weight and sound of it with obvious pleasure. "And I love you, Julian," she replied, resting her head against his shoulder as they walked slowly through the quiet garden together. Silence and all, though I am very glad that particular chapter of our story has finally come to its end. He laughed softly at that, pulling her closer, and together they continued their walk beneath the darkening sky. No longer two people separated by fear and misunderstanding, but partners fully and completely chosen, ready to face whatever came next together, side by side, exactly as they were always meant to be.